I love Mirror's Edge, and when I had the idea to make a video essay about it, I was expecting to say something along the lines of, great games with one of the most generic stories I've seen in a video game. Going back to it and playing through it again, it was clear that I didn't account for nostalgia. Don't get me wrong, Mirror's Edge is still great, but I had forgotten some of the annoying quirks it has. Returning to the game after not playing it for a year or so, I found that I messed up my jump and roll timings all the time, and that I failed at getting wall runs. While the game has a decent tutorial, it really doesn't convey the timings which are crucial in a game like Mirror's Edge. After playing through the campaign, I got the timings down, and the game flowed beautifully, with me and Fate moving in unison. You have to do things the game's way for it to work, and it isn't very generous with timing, but that being said, if you stick with the game and learn to play it according to its rules, Mirror's Edge is a total blast. It's pretty immersive with the excellent audio design of you hearing Fate's footsteps as she runs across the rooftops of the City of Glass. And it never feels as Faith is a camera with hands, and I'm still pretty impressed that rolling never feels disorienting. Faith has a quite wide arsenal of moves, and the game does a good job of almost never being very hard, more on that later, while still managing to have a decent skill ceiling. The game's skill ceiling comes from two separate sources, mastery of Faith's movement and mastery of the levels. Let me show you. In this first clip, I'm going through parts of the Pirandello Kruger level the way a first player is supposed to.
Careful, because...
Notice how the jumps are pretty easy. And here in the second clip, I'm going through the exact same part of the level, but this time I do it the fastest way I know how. The level design in Mirror's Edge is generally good, except for some annoying sections which don't feel polished. Particularly, Mission 3, Jackknife, has some portions which don't feel as they work as intended. Overall though, the game has a lot of fun levels with visuals which hold up surprisingly well to this day. The choice of having a mainly white color scheme with vibrant colors really works for me, and it does a lot to make the game more visually interesting than if it had stuck to a more naturalistic city colors. Most of the game is set on rooftops, in maintenance areas, and in office buildings, which aren't exactly the most impressive vistas in the real world, so making things white instead of grey was undoubtedly the right call. Colors also guide the player, but to be honest I can't really tell if it's effective. I know all the levels by heart, so it's very difficult to see the levels as a first time player would. If you count the prologue, there are 10 levels in Mirror's Edge, and most of them are good. But what impresses me the most, especially compared to Mirror's Edge Catalyst, is how varied the levels are. As I said, most of the time you'll be spending on rooftops, but along the way you'll visit exotic metropolis locations such as storm drains, the tube, a shopping center, and my hometown, Göteborg. The big issue the level has are pipes and air ducts, and of course elevators, but it's an older game, they need to hide the loading screen somehow. There's also a bigger issue of guards, but we'll get to that. The problem with pipes are they're pretty restrictive and slow, and I can't help but feel that it would be pretty easy to replace them with an interesting, more interactive way of climbing. And it's kind of the same story with ducts, they're slow and restrictive. If I wanted to crawl through vents, I'd just replay Deus Ex Human Revolution. Mirror's Edge is at heart a first-person platformer parkour game, but it seems like DICE or EA didn't trust the platforming sections to be enough, so the game is spiced up, in heavy air quotes, with some pretty dubious additions, such as a QuickTime event boss fight and first-person shooting. Look at this section of the QTE boss fight. Like, why was this needed? He bursts through the wall like the Kool-Aid man, and then you do literally one button press and it's over. I'm not a fan of QuickTime events, and especially not QuickTime event boss fights. And this is such a strange addition. Why couldn't it have been a real fight? I mean, there's a real in-game boss fight later, or entirely a cutscene. If I wanted QTEs, I would have played Indigo Prophecy. As mentioned, there's also a real boss fight, which happens twice with some real gameplay in between. The fighting is okay, it looks really goofy, and it's a bit more fun than it looks on screen, but the problem is, the game didn't need boss fights in my view. The combat is explained in the tutorial, but they managed to omit the fact that you can dodge, which, believe me, makes these fights suck a lot less. This brings us, unfortunately, onto combat as a whole. The idea of parkouring across rooftops while armed goons shoot at you is super cool, and breaking up your free running with beating up armored private security guards with assault rifles sounds awesome. The concept of playing that parkour scene from Casino Royale would be awesome. The problem is, concept and execution are two completely different ball games. The combat in Mirror's Edge is pretty rough. The hand-to-hand combat is alright in that you have a fair number of moves to use, but the guns are just straight up bad, which is strange. This is a DICE game. I mean, Battlefield usually has better guns than this. Among the many problems with guns is they're fairly inaccurate at range, except for the sniper rifle, and guns can't be reloaded, which makes sense. I mean, Faith isn't combat trained and doesn't carry a stack of 556 ammo while she's parkouring, but it means that you have to pick up new guns to kill more enemies, which is such a pain. It doesn't sound horrible, but empty guns don't despawn, which means you can pick them right up from the ground again, so it can be hard sometimes to know which guns have ammo and which don't. Worse though is that rifles and shotguns slow Faith down tremendously and makes her unable to climb things. Combat completely breaks the flow of the game, and on the hard difficulty, enemies kill you far too quickly, which makes combat even more of a pain. Being a platformer, as far as I can tell, difficulty only affects combat, so I recommend playing on easy to reduce frustration. Speaking of things which are slow and kind of a pain, let's move on to story. The story in Mirror's Edge is forgettable and not very well told. The animated cutscenes look pretty good, but there really isn't too much to say about it. The TLDR is basically that main character Faith's sister Kate has been set up to take the fall for the murder of Robert Pope, who's running for mayor and who your mission control mate Merc says is finally someone who can actually make a difference in this place. By the way, do parents really name their kids rhyming names? Faith and Kate? Anyway, I've played through Mirror's Edge at least 6 or 7 times, and I've never before paid attention to the story, and it turns out that was the right call. There are a couple of characters, there are some events that happen, but I don't really care. None of the characters are really all that fleshed out. If you decide to play Mirror's Edge, take my advice and just skip the story. Mirror's Edge is a game you play for the mechanics, not the story. In conclusion then, Mirror's Edge is a classic, a bold experiment in 3D platforming which holds up really well despite its age. It has a steeper learning curve than its peers in the 3D platformer genre, but it's well worth it, as mastering its systems lets one flow through the city of glass in an experience quite unlike any other 3D platformer. With excellent audio design and level design that is sometimes spotty but on many levels is excellent, prime examples being The Edge, Flight, and Pirandello Kruger. The game's campaign is very short. It took me around 2 hours to complete it when I played to get capture for the video, but there are lots of time trials and challenges, as well as it just being generally very replayable as it's a mechanics focused game. I would recommend Mirror's Edge to almost anyone. Pick it up cheap on a Steam sale. Most computers can probably run it, seeing as it's 12 years old. So just crank down the difficulty on time your rolls right, and you'll have a blast. There is a Mirror's Edge prequel, reboot, sequel, whatever. I didn't pay attention to that story either, in the form of Mirror's Edge Catalyst, a topic I'll return to later. But first, join me in 2 weeks' time as we gather for whiskey and cigars.